Dr. Geoffrey Ebbs is a researcher and lecturer at Griffith University with a diverse background in tech, media, eco-startups, politics, broadcasting, and publishing. His current research focuses on food systems and the impact of beliefs on decision-making in the face of change. He is the author of several books, including the best-selling Living on the Web for Dummies and Your Life, Your Planet, where he combines his expertise to offer practical insights on navigating the digital world and sustainability.
Hi everyone, yes, I'm Geoffrey Ebbs. I'm here to talk about goal number 12, the Sustainable Development Goal for Responsible Consumption and Production. And that, of course, raises the question about whether we're focusing on the consumer or the producer. Who is responsible? If we think about ourselves in an emergency situation, when our house catches fire, for example, we grab the kids and run. So we save ourselves first, a couple of our nearest and dearest, and if there's time, we might grab a few precious memories. So as individuals in an emergency, we act in our own self-interest and then expand to include those closest to us. If the world catches fire, though, what do we save? Our neighbours, the city, our forests, the nation, civilization, or the planet? And of course, different people take different responsibility for their own actions. Here's a graphic from the Irish government summarising progress on some targets towards responsible consumption and production. There are 11 different targets for SDG 12. Food waste, which is represented here in the top right, is a target on its own. Possible fuel subsidies below that is part of the target, remove market distortions that encourage wasteful consumption. Then we've got the organic collection and recycling, which are part of the waste generation target, and domestic material consumption, which is one of the indicators for the target sustainable management of natural resources. So the point I want to make in the context here is that 4 out of these 5 targets on the screen relate to consumers. The other target relates to the government. The government controls the fossil fuel subsidies. And so what we have here is a focus on what consumers are doing with a small note about what the government is doing, and there is nothing about what producers are doing. So the focus for a lot of these summaries of what's happening under SDG 12 focus completely on the consumers. If we look in detail at recycling, mostly we are recycling the packaging of consumer products, and developed countries like Australia, where I'm speaking from, send lots of our recycled packaging to the global south for processing. And the problem is that recycling really is just rubbish. Since I wrote the article under that headline first in 2007, most of the statistics are worse. So recent revelations about Australian recycling have caused even the most enthusiastic recyclers to give up. Europeans are obsessed about recycling. Some cities have 7 different bins to separate paper from different types of plastic and so on. What we tend to forget, though, that recycling old products consumes nearly as much energy as creating those same materials from raw products. So we're reducing our consumption of new resources. We are not using virgin resources to make new plastic, but we're not saving as much energy as we would be if we were reusing things and just reducing our use overall. Renewable energy has a different characteristic because it allows us to be producers as well as consumers. So that's one step towards converting our homes from being nodes of consumption into being hubs of production. And that's a phrase that I'll refer to a couple of times in this presentation. So with renewable energy, we're consuming less resources when we're reducing our emissions as we drive or as we cook and heat our homes, but we're still consuming cars and appliances and converting and demanding infrastructure. We're also mostly ignorant about the huge amount of energy it takes to drive a vehicle. So you can drive 500 kilometres on a car battery. That probably takes about 5 hours on a highway. Or you can power a normal suburban home in Australia for 3 days. So 3 days worth of a full family living in a rich Western lifestyle is about the same as one battery charge in an electric vehicle. There's another energy equation that we don't naturally do, and that's the amount of energy that is in our food compared to the amount of energy we use to produce that food. So in this video, Olympic cyclist is working at top speed, and it takes him about 2 minutes of that full-on energy to cook a bit of toast. So when we think about the amount of energy that we get from our food and the amount of energy we spend to make our food, we can see that we are actually very highly consumptive species, which leads me to look at where the most emissions are coming from, what's the footprint of these areas, and how much effort and money we're spending on dealing with them. So here we see energy, industry, food and land use, transportation, and the built environment. So these are the highest emitting sectors of the economy, but we're spending most of the money on electrifying the transport fleet. Now, transport is a big emitter, it's worth 15% of the emissions, but we're putting all of our energy in there because it's something we can solve. We can electrify the transport fleet. We're also spending a lot of money on renewable energy. And again, we're doing that because it's relatively easy. Industry is getting off the hook largely, and that's mainly for political reasons. It's very hard for governments in developed economies to tell industry what to do. We rely on the commercial sector for the authority of government in a lot of cases. Food and land use is interesting because it's a major emitter worth not quite a quarter of our emissions. And we are spending lots of money there, but we're spending most of that money on land use, whereas most of the emissions are coming from production and processing of food. And that's important because when we start to look at what advice people are giving, we can see here that this slide from the Singapore-based Purpose Business is advising companies that they need to decouple economic growth from environmental harm. So this means basically using technology to reduce the impact of our emissions. It's a very important part of what we do. The problem is that there is a great deal of decoupling to do. And so we're very reliant on technology to overcome the twin effects of population growth and an increase in affluence. So the black dotted line here is the gross domestic product, the amount of stuff that we produce as measured by money. Now, in the worst case, we might be increasing our emissions faster than we're increasing our gross domestic product. If we start to decouple, if we start to find ways to offset the carbon footprint of what we're doing, then that curve starts to come down, but it might still be increasing. And that's the situation we're in globally now, which is one of the reasons why we look like we're going to struggle to meet the SDG goals. To actually come within the planetary boundaries and stop the damage we're doing, we have to seriously decouple, what this slide is calling sufficient absolute decoupling. And so that requires a great deal of effort. So 3 years ago, well, actually going on 4 years ago now, I locked Professor Rosgano in the cage, a show that I've got, to ask him about his book, Reset. That book argues that the Australian economy can be reset and achieve significant economic growth by investing in renewables, regenerative farming, and careful reforestation. So I put it to him that it was going to be challenging to achieve the degree of decoupling required. And he said there's no doubt that the technology is there. We can shift from buying so much stuff to buying services and entertainment and things that aren't so polluting. And he thinks that sufficient absolute decoupling is well within reach if there is sufficient political will. So in fact, a couple of months ago, he released a report. He's a director of a group called the Superpower Institute, and he believes that in 35 years, Australia can earn $1 trillion a year from export revenue of renewable energy, which is 6 to 8 times more than we will be earning then from fossil fuels. The question about whether the political will is there to do that, though, is a difficult one. A week ago, the Australian government announced that it's not going to implement its Nature First policy. So government attempts to constrain industry are politically challenging. Some academics think that governments should not try to influence population or wealth and go straight for limiting consumption. Katya Vladimirova in this paper is basically arguing that this should be a global effort because it's rich countries that are doing most of the consuming and they're not compensating or supporting less well-off countries to overcome the impact of climate change, which they are feeling the most and contributing to the least. Other academics, such as Blake Alcott here, are suggesting that we should just be taxing impact. And it's interesting that Ross Garnaut, who we've just talked about, created a carbon tax in Australia, which is basically a tax on impact. Importantly, in this graph, we see that the red, black and green lines are all going up. So that's the emissions, the population and the wealth. Whereas the amount of carbon that's being produced per dollar created has been going down. So we are decoupling. The challenge is that over the last 3 or 4 years, this is about a 15-year-old graph now, but these numbers have come back up. And so we have stopped decoupling at the rate we were earlier this century. So when we look at the big picture, we see that rich countries and rich industries in those countries are reluctant to dial down their quest for more and more wealth. That means that we have to think as citizens about how we're going to act to address these issues. I want to concentrate that in the area of food because that's where I'm currently researching. Here we see the Asian Development Bank advising people in the food industry. 3 slides are about the production of food. 1 slide is about consumption. Food's important because it's more complicated than transport or energy. It involves biology, it involves social behaviour, it involves traditions, and it's also responsible for significant biodiversity loss and damage to water and nutrient cycles. So not only is food significant, but it's something we all care about. There's one really good news story in food production, and that is what we call the regenerative production of meat. So whereas the industrial harming of animals in feedlots has been a huge ecological and animal welfare disaster, mimicking nature-based processes to allow heavy animals to churn up the soil, fertilise the soil, spread seed, and then moving along so the soil can recover, and accompanying that with careful reforestation to slow down the water in the landscape and allow the water to soak into the ground, has had remarkable effects in overcoming desertification, reducing the damage that's done by animals, and producing meat in not just a sustainable way, but a thrivable way. This has been so successful that big money is moving into that space, and so government is recognising it as a valid form of reducing emissions and environmental damage. On the other hand, sustainable efforts by communities, this is the community garden at the block of 50 townhouses where I live. 3 years ago, this was just an empty rectangle of grass. Now it's a mixture of food, forest and allotments where people are planting their own individual crops. And the government doesn't really recognise the value of these as part of the food system. So in a recent food security inquiry in Australia, community gardens and nature-based solutions were seen to be part of the welfare sector or for local environmental groups and connected with local government, not with the federal government. Here is a community garden that I was involved with 12 years ago. I used to live in that set of apartments in the back of the picture. Over the last 2 weekends, the government has moved the police in with bulldozers to try and wreck that community garden because it's not approved or sanctioned by the government. So not only is governments not supporting these community efforts, they are in fact undermining and attacking them. And so what we do as members of the community is one of connection. So I belong to an organisation called Food Connect. The Food Connect shed is owned by 550 community members, and it's a place where a lot of food processors, growers and consumers come together. This is the event space. There are commercial kitchens, commercial cool rooms, community mill for milling grain and creating flour. And so it's a community-owned asset that tries to do that job of connecting these grassroots community projects to the food system. And so we believe that's very important work. The Food Connect Foundation created a food summit, and the Value Chain Coordination Project, which that QR code links you to, provides a lot of information about how we're doing this across southeast Queensland. So the challenge: governments may not deliver. Recycling is just a part of the waste system. Electrification needs resources, and decoupling is a technical race against time and against population growth and affluence. Food is complex but essential, and so that's where I'm working. I believe that homes and communities must become hubs of production. This is an important part of the process of creating momentum in the opposite direction from business as usual. Sharing that with the neighbours starts to build that process of community and connection, and people like Food Connect allow us to connect to institutions, to connect our reach and influence. And so if we are wise about the way we organise ourselves, then we can help decouple, but we can also help degrow and decolonise. These are very important parts of reversing the damage that we're currently doing. First and foremost, we need to realise we can't do it alone. We need to build community and keep community. I've crunched the numbers. There's a whole section at the back of this book which is about the impact of each thing that we can do, and a lot of those numbers are not very effective. Really, food is one of the biggest things that we can change to reduce our footprint, bigger than transport in our the part that we have control of. Thanks very much for your time. This is a picture of Lake Nuganuga, where I spent last Easter in Western Queensland on the lands of the Karinjabal and Bidjara people. Thanks very much.